One is entitled Decolonizing Archaeology, Lessons from African Burial Ground 30 Years Later. A few housekeeping notes, if everyone could mute themselves for the time being to keep the noise to a minimum. Second thing is we are all here to learn together. And so there are no silly questions. And finally, we are going to be recording. So just wanted to let you know, you're going to hear the sound saying, we're about to record.
Recording in progress.
Awesome. So my name is Shana Sabio. I am co-founder and co-director of Grow House NYC, and I am also lead organizer for the Flatbush African Burial Ground Coalition. So the Flatbush African Burial Ground Coalition, next slide please, Caleb, is a Black-led multiracial group of activists, architects, artists, farmers, scholars, just generally neighbors and supporters who want to protect the sacred ground at Bedford and Church from further desecration and destruction. Next slide, please. So we have three main demands. The first is to stop the building of affordable housing and all development plans on this site. The second is we would like for this land to remain public and be placed under the stewardship of the Descendant community, a term that we'll get into more detail during the teach-in. And finally, we want support for a true community engagement process that will center the voices of the Descendant community. The agenda for today is pretty simple. We're going to spend the first few minutes grounding ourselves in where the site is and why we're here. And we'll spend the majority of the time learning together. And we'll have a Q&A portion at the end. And we'll also then share some announcements for upcoming actions. All right. So a little bit more grounding. Why are we here? As a coalition, one of the things that we hold dear to us as a value is the democratization of knowledge. We believe that lack of transparency shows up as an overcomplication of ideas. And what that does is lock communities out of the process because they don't feel it's accessible. We also believe that we can build community engagement, true community engagement through education and through simplification of concepts and knowledge. The second reason why we're here is we want to craft a collective roadmap. We believe that as development continues, there are going to be more African burial grounds that are found all throughout the nation and throughout the city. And so we want to make sure that we can co-create a roadmap with people who have done this work already and leave behind a blueprint for future work. Next slide. And so we're hoping that this will be a rich and fruitful conversation. We have a wonderful group of panelists as well as organizers from the Flatbush African Burial Ground Coalition who will be in conversation with one another around the topic for today. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. Great. So where is the African Burial Ground? It's located in the heart of Flatbush at the corner of Bedford and Church Avenues. The official address is 2286 Church Avenue. Next slide. We believe that the burial ground actually extends further than what is left. We believe it extends to the left or actually to the west of what is left right now across the street into the post office and into a gas station that is across Bedford Avenue. We believe this due to anecdotal evidence from historical research that has been done. And so we are trying to stop the further desecration of the site. Next slide, please. A little bit more grounding. Enslaved Africans arrived in Dutch Brooklyn around 1660, and their labor was used to clear the forests, build infrastructure such as roads, construct homes and churches, as well as farm the land. And in fact, by 1800, 30% of Flatbush residents were enslaved, and about 7 out of every 10 or 8 out of every 10 Dutch families in Dutch Flatbush were slaveholders. And until the 1800s, enslaved African labor was used to make Brooklyn the second largest producer of agricultural products, second only to Queens. As I said, the site has been desecrated numerous times, starting in 1840 with the construction of the first Flatbush schoolhouse, where there were remains found. During 1860s, during the construction of Bedford Avenue, more remains were found. And between the periods of 1890 and 1904, during the construction of the sewer system, more remains were found. And in fact, in the year 2000, an archaeological study was done by Historical Perspectives, Inc. And that analysis showed that the remains were of African descent. And we were able to find the names of 2 of the enslaved people who were interred at that site. And so it is in their honor that we are doing this work, as well as in honor of our ancestors whose names we may not know. So I invite us all to have a brief moment of silence in honor of these ancestors. Thank you. Next 3 slides, Caleb. These are just some of the names that we were able to find using the 1755 census, slave census. And next, we're going to move to an Indigenous land acknowledgement done by a wonderful thought partner in this entire process named Kelly.
Thank you all for joining us today. As we gather today from various places around the globe, many of us are doing so while sitting on unceded territory stolen from Indigenous people. As we sit in Brooklyn on the unceded territory of the Canarsie and the Nyack, subgroups of the Indigenous Lenape people. That ongoing theft, along with the stolen blood and work of enslaved Africans and African-descended individuals, facilitates our presence. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and future who have stewarded this land. We recognize the hundreds of Indigenous nations who continue to resist and uphold their sacred culture. We know that this acknowledgement is neither sufficient nor complete, but a part of a process of learning to become a more thoughtful and negotiate new and equitable ways forward.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And so now we're going to dig into the meat of the presentation, and we want to welcome Dr. Michael Blakey. And we are so grateful for him taking his time during what I'm sure is a very busy season. So I'll do a brief introduction. Michael Blakey is National Endowment for the Humanities Professor of Anthropology, Africana Studies, and American Studies, and founding director for the Institute of Historical Biology at William and Mary. Dr. Blakey has held professorships at Spelman College, Columbia, Brown, La Sapienza, and Howard University, where he founded the W. Montague Cobb Biological Anthropology Laboratory. He has served as president of the Association of Black Anthropologists and member of the editorial board of American Anthropologists and American Antiquity. He's also represented the United States on the Council of the 4th World Archaeological Congress in Cape Town, South Africa. He is a member of the Scholarly Advisory Committee of the National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian Institution, where he previously held the position of Research Associate in Physical Anthropology at the National Museum of Natural History. He was scientific director of the New York African Burial Ground Project, the most sophisticated bioarchaeological project in the United States. The Manhattan site became a US National Monument in 2007. So we really want to extend a warm welcome to you, Dr. Blakey. And one of the things that we talked about during our study of your work is really just trying to personalize you and understand what your passions are. So we're going to ask you to give a brief 3-minute autobiography of yourself, answering 3 questions. The first, who are you and what do you value? The second, whose are you, meaning who are your people, who are your ancestors? And the third is what roads led you to the study of physical anthropology. Welcome once again.
Well, thank you, Ms. Sabio. I'm a little taken a little off guard. What do I value? Well, I value people. I value history. I value love, and many specific things like sailing and food and gardening. Who are my people? My father's people were enslaved in Virginia. Our home place is in Orange, near James Madison's plantation, where our family cemetery lies. My mother's people were a mixed Afro-Indian group in Delaware called Nanticokes or Nanticoke Moors. And I spent my childhood walking the cornfields I'm from Washington, D.C. I was born and raised there, but we often went to visit my mother's folks 2 hours away. And I spent time with my Uncle Kermit, one of them who, they spent time walking the cornfields and the soybean fields looking for artifacts. And so I grew up with that kind of archaeology. I would just say I was a nerd in the sense that the science fair was my joy every year. And I won the grand prize in Washington when I was 15 in the science fair on archaeology. I then went to, because my father was a dentist at Howard University, I will say I am a Howard brat. Then got, he helped, introduced me to Don Ortner at the Smithsonian, one of the founders of paleopathology, where I did my own research in paleopathology on 50 native crania when I was 15 and onward. So life has been good.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that answer. And I will cede the floor to you to share with us the insight and knowledge that you've gathered through your work on the African Burial Ground Project in Manhattan. And thank you for that answer.
Well, thank you. And good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to give as much of a blow-by-blow of what happened on the African burial ground in the 1990s and early 21st century as I can within a half an hour. The kinds of interactions that you might see. And so I invite you to compare these with your struggle, and maybe by giving you some detail that is not generally out there, you'll have be able to avoid some of the pitfalls. I think I did share with Ms. Sabio, I would certainly share if I haven't, last year's publication in Current Anthropology, which is the leading international journal in anthropology, called Archaeology Under the Blinding Light of Race. And it is my description that I can make after the fact of what happened. But what I'm going to tell you today is more detailed. Federal building construction on what is today 290 Broadway at Foley Square unearthed a history and sacred space that was, by most accounts of a white supremacist education, not supposed to be there. America's justification was written as the land of the free. The emancipatory narrative David Blight writes about, which took hold of national identity after the Civil War, was meant to paint Southern slavery as an anomaly, not the essence of the nation. The African burial ground brought forth the corporal evidence of 15,000 human bodies. 419 were excavated, but there was the basis for the estimation of 15,000, that in the 18th century, all of the 13 colonies enslaved Africans. The very presence of Africans in New York had been minimized to avoid the story of its slavery. But in the early 1990s, despite attempts, the story of the nation's complete dependence upon the unrewarded labor of Blacks had to stand. Those Africans, memorial, must be honored, cried their disinherited descendants. Allies of goodwill often joined African Americans and others of the diaspora who protested in the streets of Manhattan in 1991 and 1992. Oh, I'm sorry, I have the first slide. May I have the second slide, please? All human beings should know the humane significance of the burial of the dead, or funerary treatment of one kind or another, which has been an essential, exclusive, and definitive human quality since our species began. White supremacy, justifying slavery and the current takings of white privilege, sought to deny Black people personhood, played out on the African burial ground in the government's desecrations of the present construction as it had of 18th century white industrial use of the cemetery as a dump or source of illegal anatomical cadavers, all in the strata where archaeologists found carefully placed burials by Africans. Legally required archaeology at the site, meant to make way for construction, nonetheless afforded official opportunities for public comment. That comment would be hard fought for and won as descendant community oversight. My African Burial Ground project at Howard University in Washington was assembled to step in on behalf of an activist Black community that was on it from the first press reports in October of 1991. By the end, perhaps of a long struggle of irony, numb greed, petty, conscientious stupidity, honor, bravery, and even brilliance had taken place. A U.S. national monument would replace the plaque on the wall of a building once promised, but scrapped. The next slide, please. The African Burial Ground Project had devised a clientage model. I'm sorry, is there another slide? Try the next one. Oh, it's a, all right, that's fine. Yeah, African Burial Ground, and this is the monument.
I think it's the next slide, Caleb.
Okay, well, let's still go up to the front when you were on. I didn't know that the previous one was there. This is fine. And then we'll go to the next one in a moment. Oh, I see. Yes, I think we do need the next one. Thank you. Sorry, please, the next slide. The African Burial Ground Project had devised a clientage model by which we had come to work for, not with, the descendant community, a term I coined in the praxis of New York, now in common usage among community activists, archaeologists, and preservationists. Both the sanctity and memory of the African burial ground were achieved. But the real story of how it was won is long and complicated. It is, and has always been, I think, but one manifestation of the African diaspora's struggle with white supremacy. White people have constructed themselves with the entitlements of the only real, complete human beings in the room. These may take, with moral impunity, from the Black as non-person, in Montague Cobb's words. The struggle at the African burial ground 10 to 30 years ago was a struggle for human rights. It has always been important for me that this enormous and costly struggle not be for one event, localized in time and space, but that we researchers institutionalize it and make what was learned there and fought for of generalizable use. I founded the Institute for Historical Biology at William & Mary for that purpose. By the end of this presentation, you will see why that which was meant for Howard University in the long run would not happen there, but in part. The most fundamental result affecting preservation, archaeology, and historic preservation everywhere in the world is the concept of descendant community, and at best, the clientage model for which the term was first coined in New York City. An ultimate testimony to its utility is represented by the National Trust for Historic Preservation's rubric for engaging descendant communities for the interpretation of slavery at historic sites and museums in 2018. I'm proud to have been part of the drafting of that document that gives imprimatur to the efforts of descendant communities everywhere in the nation for achieving structural parity, equal power to others in all sites of American history. In fact, that document shows the centerpiece of American history is slavery. I've been writing, however, that descendants should have the go, no-go decision over burial sites. Let me explain. The definition of the descendant community, or the ethical client on this chart, is key. They are the self-selected authorial voice on their community. The means of their self-selection needs to be assured, as is the establishment of an organization that assures their integrity, as the kind of social descendancy we will see is inclusive of, but not exclusive to, lineal descendants. The social group, like the tribes under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or ethnic groups, constitutes a surrogate for family. Indeed, the Virginia Commonwealth University's Family Representative Council makes that surrogacy explicit, that FRC is their descendant community dealing with the memorialization and other disposition of remains that were in a well, in a 19th century well, used as robbed from Blacks' graves and used as cadavers at the medical school there. One might ask, what white people claim descendancy from enslaved Africans? There's this debate about whether a descendant community can be all African Americans. A descendant of the enslaved would all be African Americans. The criteria are specific to those most affected, thus the ethical client, by the treatment of particular ancestral remains in their history. Now, say I'm also working with Native Virginia Indians and others who are descendant communities of other cemeteries. These criteria were worked out in New York in the 1990s against white and city bureaucrats and archaeologists claiming that they were also communities, or that as in American history, everyone should participate in multiculturalism. Anthropologists have critiqued this idea of multiculturalism, which is often used to marginalize particular voices in favor of an ideal of the whole, which in this case resorts back to the business as usual of white control, as the Black voice is squeezed out by other stakeholders. And that's absolutely what was going on in New York. The Black community could see that with every mention of multiculturalism, even a discussion of our research needing to be multicultural, when we said it was in the tradition of African diasporic intellectuals whose anti-racist work and vindicationist work and activist scholarship informed us. They said, well, shouldn't you be multicultural? You have every right to descendant community control based on who is buried there. It is both a human right and established by much, though not all, archaeological practice today. Again, descendants are members of the social group descended from that of the deceased, inclusively defined but not unbounded, among whom there may be lineal descendants or not, and who must care about the disposition of the site. The latter criterion brings ethics into the picture because it becomes possible to do harm to those who care. There will be normal reasons for any human beings to differ about such important and therefore emotion-laden sites. With the mandate of community empowerment, it is incumbent upon the organizing community to decide on research and memorialization as they become informed. They have to work it out amongst themselves, a process that is often difficult, if salubrious. I learned that word some years ago. I fell in love with it. It's difficult, but it's healthy. It is important to watch for provocateurs. I think we had some 30 years ago in New York, who show up to disrupt and then disappear, or sellouts who work as Black people for the property owner or bureaucracy and against community wishes. Alex Jones, a young Black archaeologist, knowledgeable about the landowner's opposition to the descendant community, actually decided in Bethesda, Maryland, and you'll hear more about them later, to work for the landowner, and helped them produce PR efforts to show that that landowner had a Black archaeologist to defend their construction, their development. They will at times also seek to steer community interests, as Ron Law, a small-time Black politico who was brought into the New York African burial ground discussion in the late 1990s, brought together a team of, including a Black PR consultant and someone without knowledge of memorialization, and began working to divide the community and the press. Watch for them, and watch for the stall. In the initial year, when Mayor Dinkins and Senator Patterson's community groups met bi-weekly with the GSA, the General Services Administration, who is on this chart is our business client, but they are the ones who are building the building and responsible for paying for the research and memorialization, when we were meeting with them, and the community had done so every 2 weeks, the GSA just led them on. They repeatedly said they took community advisement to Washington, which a later congressional hearing showed to be untrue, and never thinking the law actually called for diligent response to comments they were legally required to hear. Today, there is a similar tactic at James Madison's Montpelier, where the board of directors had to agree with structured parity with community empowerment under the rubric of the National Trust, only to spend subsequent months with their lawyers revising the memorandum of agreements language that would essentially put the board back in charge. Whiteness is adamant about its right to control, even fragile, as Robin DiAngelo puts it, in its alarmist defensiveness against the questioning of it. Having once publicly announced agreement, the Montpelier Descendants Committee continues today in backroom debate with the white board, still without parity, but I think they'll get it. In New York, we went around and around in circles for over a year, introducing ideas for memorialization at GSA's biweekly meetings until someone, Alton Maddox, brought Congress into the picture, brought the Black Chicago Congressman Gus Savage, who chaired the committee that oversaw the GSA's $6 billion assets, along with Mayor Dinkins. Together with David Patterson, then a state senator, they introduced a federal advisory committee with a mandate to make decisions. The community would meet to change the composition of that committee, however. They walked down the street to a familiar buffet, held a meeting, and returned to insist 7 of their members, a sufficiently empowered group, among the government's appointees. I was there that day. It was a beautiful thing to see. Time and again, I have found my colleagues, like most white Americans, complicit or plain cowardly in contributing to Blacks' dismissal by developers and bureaucracies. In New York, the community activists made it possible for my research team to receive a fair hearing on our superior credentials to those we replace. Those are the ones we replaced. We held public hearings open to New Yorkers who could see the difference in our approaches. We were knowledgeable about Africana studies, human biology, and public engagement. On the other side, the Metropolitan Forensic Anthropology team, whose the forte was the estimation of race from hip measurements, and were ignorant of historical and cultural context, among other problems. Indeed, the one white archaeologist who had worked on a Black site was already in place. On the original archaeological firm's principal investigator, had only a high school diploma, but he was white. And he had a British accent. And these are the real dimensions of our society at that time and since. That to some things are given. And we had a chance to receive what we had earned. I would strike a deal with a large contract archaeology firm, John Milner Associates, requiring them to step aside with a contract only for the adjacent courthouse site and the Office of Public Education and Interpretation, which they already held, and which Black anthropologist Cheryl Wilson actually managed, leaving my Howard team to run the project, installing my 30 PhDs and 9 labs to do the work on our own for the Descendant community. As you will see, such work may not be the path most traveled by with ease. Today, as then, many Blacks among them prefer the easy route. Recently, and now go into more detail, at Bethesda, Maryland's Moses Cemetery, of the 2 archaeologists we tried to bring in to work for Descendants, one sold out to Montgomery County, who became their future client. They said they would work with us, but they then had been signing a contract with the county against that. And the other demurred, basically chickened out after showing some interest. The community was attempting to put me in place among the archaeologists the county had selected, with the idea that I would provide reliable information about the discovery of remains threatened by construction. I also proposed further excavation to demonstrate, one way or another, whether bones were under the construction site or not. As the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition began to make headway after years of protest, the landowner hired a Black archaeologist who I've already described, aided by the fact that things had been bogged down for years, partly due to false starts with other archaeologists. 30 years ago in New York, we held hearings downtown and in Harlem for a year, examining our research questions and those of community members. Invasive and other methods required careful scrutiny. We scholars responded to the Descendant community's concerns and revised our research design to fit consensual research plans, so long as they were consistent with the rules of evidential knowledge defining our professions, as you see on the chart. The Federal Steering Committee, representing Descendants, met and approved these. The GSA agreed to contract for the completion of the research design, but we would find that their actual letting of contracts, piece by piece, by modifications, would leave us vulnerable to their ultimate reneging on the expensive DNA research and writing, which came at the tortured end of our work. What I described below is how we, nonetheless, created the most sophisticated project. Next slide, please. And 2,500 page reports ever produced in bioarchaeology. These results made domestic African-American archaeology a story told in the context of the diaspora and the Atlantic world, of interest to Black people for the first time. You know, we were always interested in Egypt. This is here. I think that was true because of all the ways research was improved by belonging to them. That is an example of the democratization of knowledge. But as an elder sister once warned me early on, be sure to put your name on everything because they will try to steal it. She was right. Much amnesia about our project and attempts by others to claim the development of the project, much less the development of the origins of publicly engaged archaeology have followed. But our name is on everything we did. And if you do not see it, it ain't us. One of the key tropes of white theft, and this includes many New York historians, is the claim that the work is poor, it's politically biased, or technically inadequate. Like Derek Bell's dismissal of Black witnesses in court as so-called special pleading. They have no authoritative, credible voice. And then they take it to fix it, but actually just put their name on it. For me, the unnamed Black author of a stunning 1930s Works Progress Administration book called The Negro in Virginia tells that sad end of such a tale. The best of Howard stopped this attempt of the Army Corps of Engineers and Statistical Research Incorporated. They had recommended to rewrite our reports when GSA and the Army Corps had us hire them for copy editing, or as the self-published book Sankofa with a question mark some may have come across, which claims that one now disgruntled senior white osteologist did everything that our chapter 4 demonstrates was entirely collective. You know, the work of 25 people at any one time in the one Cobb laboratory, much less the others. She, apart from her own white arrogance, which required me to let her go early in the project, was but part of a large and diverse project under Mark Mack's supervision and my instruction as principal investigator. The concepts of a competent principal investigator and a Negro are imagined to be incompatible, it seems. The book was published to discredit. An article by Eric Siemens in a major history journal denied that the Sankofa symbol we may have found at the African burial ground had not existed in Ghana because no colonizing European had seen an example of it. Despite the obvious fallacy of the historian's truth criterion, we discovered that Siemens had evidence in an Adinkra cloth in a Dutch collection that he had seen, but misreported as not having the Sankofa symbol. And my article, Archaeology Under the Blinding Light of Race, gives you all those references. But the New York Times picked up this story at the eve of the 2010 opening of the African Burial Ground Visitor Center, again, discrediting us by a stunted white imagination of the possibility of equal or superior Black scholarship. Because sometimes Black scholars have superior credentials to some white scholars. It's not a general racial thing. It is about competencies. Siemens' point was that Blacks should know themselves as Creoles, not Africans. How is this his business? Next slide, please. Similarly, the New York Historical Society extended no collegiality in its autonomous use of the prominent African burial ground in its exhibition on slavery in New York in 2011. As Miriam Francis and a group of Black women who came for the Schomburg's lecture in that museum agreed, the white staff were, quote, just smiling, in answer to my question of how it felt to be there. I call this the current racism with a smile. White historians in New York would insist upon taking the history of slavery as their own property with a smile. While memorialization would again proceed simultaneously with research planning in the early 21st century at the African burial ground, these were halted, as was research funding, in the late 1990s when GSA thought the lights had dimmed. On the eve of the presidential election of 2000, Congressman Rangel thought he had a rein on the GSA to turn it around, but Bush won instead. The GSA brought in 3 Black people, a manager, Ron Law, who I've mentioned, a PR person, and an incompetent replacement for the very competent Peggy King Yorta, who had begun the competition for a monument that was ended halfway. And they were brought in to do nothing in blackface. 9/11 and rope-a-dope would eventually bring the other signatories of the Memorandum of Agreement, that's the New York Landmarks Commission and the President's Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, I think the Park Service might have been with them, back to us to resume our research, to force GSA back to the table. We had refused to pen the word final on the progress report of an incompletely funded and therefore incomplete project. So the GSA, that is its required project, incomplete, remained out of compliance with the law. The best of Howard, I like to call them, stayed with us despite GSA's threat to hold us in non-compliance that would have negatively impacted all Howard research proposals. And so we were able to withstand and to use that strategy of rope-a-dope. The worst of Howard, its president, H. Patrick Swigert, would ultimately sacrifice the anthropology program, excuse me, which was allowed, pardon me, which was allowed to die. Black schools had always been reasonably critical of anthropology in general, although our transformed anthropology was loved. We were able to complete the project under contract to Howard, with me as a subcontract to the new Institute for Historical Biology, because of the best of Howard, hanging on bravely. Memorialization would also be restarted and completed after GSA's attempt to use us as a punching bag were ineffectual in anything but showing themselves to be out of line. We let them tire themselves out in the press. We used their non-compliance with agreements as evidence against them in the press. New National Park Service personnel and old and new legislators restarted the competitions that led to the Schomburg's Rites of Ancestral Return ceremony in 2003, an African Burial Ground National Monument in 2007, and the Visitor Center, which followed. These are the results of our refusal to take no for an answer, requiring persistence, organizing, record keeping, media handling, keeping our constant and often complicated debate with the public in the public eye and transparent. We had support by Blacks, Latinos, whites, and others within the various agencies where they sat. Right? I had a friend who once said, we need someone in every room to move the information to the right places. And of course, supportive legislators lobbied by diverse public sectors. Even today, however, the African Burial Ground Monument site is fraught. Despite some very good programs, it appears they were under vocal criticism for ending or over-limiting their volunteer program at the 20th anniversary of the site, locking out original activists. These folks protested outside the Schomburg as we celebrated that anniversary. The National Park Service attempted to remove our volumes of research from the monument's website. The distribution of our paper publication was already limited and often in GSA's and Howard's storage. When our research team banded together to warn the superintendent, Shirley McKinney, that we would publicly object to the false pretense of a law requiring them to remove our publications, she recanted in 2016 that she was mistaken. The reports and academic volumes have been restored to the website, but they are increasingly hard to find there, hidden in a morass of other materials. The site's historian, Michael Frazier, masterminded the removal of our publications. The National Park Service's site's personnel also led an attempt to grab for Howard University's bone samples after the untimely death of its curator, Mark Mack, in 2012. By spreading a rumor that Howard did not want the responsibility the Black community had given them to safeguard samples from the African burial ground. A rumor I heard while sitting at lunch with the Black president of the American Anthropological Association, New Yorker Leith Mullings, at a hotel in Sao Paulo, Brazil. We were attending a conference there. Leith handed me the phone to handle it. Discovering the rumor completely untrue, as Howard had maintained the Cobb Laboratory, now in the biology department, I challenged McKinney, who said it was the work of a renegade employee. It appears, based on recent discussion with Howard, that they are trying to make yet another grab as we speak, unable to recognize that the disposition of whoever was making the grab, that the disposition of another descendant community's ancestors is essentially none of their business. They're serving those white colleagues who wish to make business of Black people's bones. If I sum up here, coming to the end, this is not the site which was to belong to the people. New Yorkers need to take hold of what years of painful struggle provided for the use of their memory and hold the African Burial Ground National Monument accountable to them today. Not knowing much of the story I have just told, I assume, you do know how much there is still to be appreciated by that grand monument. I'm not saying there's not a great deal there. Nonetheless, it was fought for. hard. I see the use of our data every week as well throughout the world. Most importantly, Descendant community empowerment is growing site by site, and a convening of those communities is imminent. The power of those who stand upon the ground that dignifies their memory of the past is an amazing thing to see. I hope your efforts here in Brooklyn will be stellar, that you will avoid or overcome the mistakes of the past. As I end, I think of Joan Maynard, an important advocate for the community as a member of the Federal Advisory or Steering Committee. Like others of your community then, we had a long conversation on a train to New York from Albany, where we had been snowbound at a legislative meeting. I think she interviewed me. I'm forever grateful for her willingness to listen and her decision to support the use of our skills. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Blakey. We really appreciate that inside information. And so now we're going to ask for folks, if you have any questions, please populate them in the chat. We're going to have our other panelists speak, and then we will go to the Q&A section. So next slide, please. We're going to go back to this quote by Frederick Douglass, which was inside of Dr. Blakey's article. "The neutral scholar is an ignoble man." And we're going to introduce our three next panelists. Next slide, please. So we have Dr. Uzma Rizvi. Dr. Rizvi, welcome. If you could answer those same three autobiographical questions, we'll begin with you.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for asking this, because it makes me feel seen and acknowledged. And much gratitude to all of you for creating this space and inviting me to be part of this really important work. I'm honored to be virtually sitting behind such intellectual giants, and I'm grateful to their work that has paved the way for so much work revolving around equity and justice. So who am I? I was named Uzma Zahra Rizvi, daughter of Nishat and Wazarat Rizvi, who first came to this country in the early 1970s, stayed in Lenape land. They come from Pakistan, and prior to that, India. And so I am second generation immigrant from South Asia, and I'm Muslim by practice. I'm going to combine kind of how that relates to archaeology, because in some sense, I feel like it's also linked, archaeology is also linked to who I am. I think I may have started in archaeology for a different reason, and I have a different reason for staying. I actively and intentionally choose to stay in this field, although I do kind of push its limits, perhaps, but only because I believe in its capacity to help bring about change and liberation. I started out because I loved the connection I felt between the ancient artifact and its life since it was made, and that thousands of years later, it could become part of my life as well, and I was a part of its life, right? So it allowed me to know and understand a world beyond my own time. And I've stayed in archaeology because as I was being taught archaeology, I realized that I didn't agree with any of the ways it was being taught. And so I had to really kind of recognize that the way it was being taught maintained, as Dr. Blakey just said, a white heteromale on the top. And I realized that with so much power embedded in history, I couldn't let this be the way archaeology maintained itself. And it's through that I started to look at how archaeological information was being cataloged and written about in the past. And I wanted to make sure that people today understood that just because someone wrote something 200 years ago doesn't mean we can't look at it and say, that is incorrect and based entirely on your racist idea of the world. And so, as you can imagine, I'm trying to undo racism, patriarchy, sexism in a field that has long been all of those things. I still love that artifacts and sites let me time travel. And it reminds me that these stories don't end, that their stories continue into our lifetimes. And it's that same, and I think that similarly with the African burial ground, right? Just because people were buried hundreds of years ago doesn't mean their lives or the spaces they inhabited stop having significance. There's a power in that realization, in that connection with the past. And just kind of thinking back to the lower Manhattan African burial ground, that experience really helped me realize that even if you want to erase a certain kind of history, it will still rise. right? And archaeology needs to make space for these realities that are outside what is taught. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that answer. So next we have Dr. Tom Ngadi. Tom, would you also answer these 3 autobiographical questions in 3 minutes? Welcome.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, good. Tom Ngadi. I'm retired from teaching urban planning at the City University of New York. I didn't start as an urban planner, but I got involved in urban planning in the 1960s and 70s when I joined the struggles against the displacement of communities resulting from the federal urban renewal program. And these were led by the civil rights movement, activists all over the country. And I was convinced that urban planning was a potential vehicle for getting more engaged in the struggles to protect communities from being displaced, principally African-American communities of color, among the first major urban renewal programs in New York City was a large Puerto Rican community in Manhattan. So who are my ancestors? I was born in Brooklyn in a community of Italian Americans. My ancestors came from southern Italy, which has been often the land of the outcast for the from the northern Italians, northern Europeans. My ancestors came from North Africa and from southern Italy. And so I just want to reveal one story that helped me to understand who I am and where I came from. After long discussions with a Native American colleague, as I visited his place and his spaces in the Southwest, I told him about how I'd lived all over the world. I lived in Latin America. I worked in Latin America. I worked in Italy. And I got all these Fulbrights to go all over the world and travel. And I wound up only blocks away from the place I was born. And he said to me, "Aha, so you too have a sense of place." And it was, the light bulb went off. And it helped me to understand better where this sensitivity to place came from. And it inevitably linked to the whole question of racialized displacement that got me involved in urban planning to begin with. And so that led me to a career of working with community-based planning, particularly in New York City, but all over the country and the world as well, and rejecting so much of the orthodoxy in urban planning about community planning, which is all about so many of the phony participatory exercises put forth by planning academicians and official organizations of government.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ngadi. And finally, our last panelist is Dr. Marcia Coleman Adebayo. And Marcia, if you're here, I think she might have had to jump off,
I'm here.
Yay, you're here. Awesome. If you could answer these three questions. So the first, who are you? What are your values? Whose are you? Who are your people? Who are your ancestors? And what roads led you to the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition?
Yeah, first of all, thank you and all the planners for this incredible presentation and thought-provoking program. So who are you? I'm from Detroit, Michigan originally, and I'm from a family of people who were engaged in political struggle, like for most Africans in this country, I suppose. My grandmother actually fought the Klan in our little southern town in Portsmouth, Ohio. So I grew up, understanding something from a very early age about what it meant to be colonized and to be living in the context of a larger society that hated you and hated your culture and was prepared to use violence against you. So my grandmother fought against the Klan, but at the same time that we saw the ugliness of white supremacy, she had a sawed-off shotgun by the front door, and so I understood something from a fairly early age about resistance and about the ways in which Black people resisted white supremacy and white violence. And my mother, on the other hand, was a little bit different. She fought the Detroit public school system because when I was growing up, basically they were channeling Black students into working for Ford Motor Company and out of the college prep program. And so she fought to make sure that Black students in the Detroit public school system had an opportunity to do something other than work for Ford Motor Company or GM. So who I am, I'm sort of grew up as an activist, but and I'm still an activist, but with academic training, obviously, I'm a political scientist. I'm a political scientist by profession, and so I've sort of straddled both worlds of academia and activism. But I see myself as an activist scholar. Whose are you and who are your people, your ancestors? My ancestors are the people who were kidnapped from West and Central Africa. And I feel a great deal of kinship with my ancestors on both sides, both those who were kidnapped and those who struggled in this country. And I've spent a lot of time within the field of political science. I'm considered an Africanist, which means that my concentration is in African studies. And so I've spent a large portion of my life in Africa. And I'm a member of an African family now. And so I've been able to really sort of merge my love of Africa with, in fact, having a family now in Africa. So my ancestors are on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean now. And what roads led you to the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition? I think it was the road that led me there was just the dishonesty and the racism and the patronizing attitude of Montgomery County government. My husband had just become pastor of the only remaining African church in Bethesda, Maryland, which is a very elite community within the United States. It has one of the highest GDPs in the United States. And I was asked as a first lady to go to a meeting at a planning board. And in honesty, I didn't know what a planning board was. I had never been involved with a planning board. And when I got there, it just reminded me very much of the colonial situations that I encountered in Africa, where sort of the white staff members were basically looking down on the Black folks who were members of this little Black church and basically telling us that there was a myth of an African burial ground in Bethesda, but we weren't to worry our little heads about it, that they were taking care of everything. that it was just simply a myth, and that they were going to hire an anthropologist or archaeologist to look into this myth of an African burial ground, but just leave everything in their hands. They would take care of everything, and all we needed to do was just sign on the dotted line to say that they had given us this briefing and that they were going to move forward and do their jobs. There was a man who was sitting next to me who I didn't know very well, who was a trustee at the church, and he raised his hand and he said, Miss, I think, Wright, you keep calling the burial ground a myth, but it's not a myth. I used to play in the burial ground as a child. We used to play hide and go seek in that burial ground. And then the 1950s and 60s, the whites came in and they destroyed all the tombstones, and he started explaining what happened. And I saw that the director of the program was becoming, sort of turning purple at that point, because she realized, as we all did across the table, that we were listening to oral history, and that Mr. Matthews was in fact detailing the history of this community that had been erased by Montgomery County. And then very, very quickly, I asked her, well, if this was a burial ground, where are the bodies now? And she said, I think I don't know. And I said, then we're looking at a crime scene. We need to find out where these bodies are, because we're looking at a crime scene. And at that point, I think she called the meeting to a close and said that, she would have to get back to us. In the preceding months, however, we found out that, in fact, Montgomery County was engaged in a full-scale cover-up of this burial ground. I tried very hard to involve Dr. Blakey, because Michael and I had been friends for a very long time. In fact, Dr. Blakey actually introduced me to this issue when he was head of the burial ground and he was doing the research at Howard University. And I tried to involve him, and Montgomery County would not have it. In fact, I think for the first time in the history of Montgomery County, they actually passed a resolution that an archaeologist could not go into a burial site. And that's just how hard they have been fighting to keep anyone who could provide information to this community about what happened to their ancestors. In the last couple of years now, we've written a book about this community that we've worked with the U.S. Commission on 400 Years of African American History, received grants from them. We're now focused on a second exhibit at the American University to explore the life and culture and just the circumstances of this community. And on Monday, we will be in court fighting to stop a corporation called Charger Ventures from buying the cemetery and buying the remains underneath the ground. We've already won a TRO, and now we're going for a preliminary injunction on Monday. And after that, if we are able to prevail, then we will have our day in court to hear our lawsuit. So we have been involved in a very what road led me? That's the road of justice. That's the road that led me to what we now call the Bethesda African Cemetery, and it's been a very long and winding road. But now we're beginning to see that the nation is becoming aware of this struggle. So I think I'll end my comments there.
Thank you so much for that. It was really illuminating and enlightening, and we're wishing you good luck in court. And we also will allow you to share additional announcements about that towards the end of the presentation. So now we're going to move into question and answers. And we've gotten some really great ones in the chat. We're going to start with one that will be addressed from Ann Holder to Dr. Blakey. And you can stop sharing, Caleb. Perfect. Go ahead, Anne. You have the floor.
Hi, thanks for that. These have raised really crucial issues as we go forward with this. So I wanted to raise a question that I think we've all been concerned about. There's been a lot of discussion about the presence or absence of actual remains on the Bedford and Church site. And that question has come to be used as kind of a litmus test for whether the land should be set aside for remembrance or excavated. But as we saw at the beginning of the presentation, there's plenty of documentary and photographic evidence that remains were uncovered in earlier excavations, but due to desecration, it's kind of unclear where they may be located now or if they're located anywhere on the land. But could you speak to this question of whether finding remains should be the decisive factor and whether this piece of now open land should be preserved as a memorial site?
And that question is directed to Dr. Blakey, right?
Yeah. No, I don't. I think if there's historical record of a cemetery founded in any way, a map, for example, that one can presume that there are human remains within those bounds. The descendant community should be involved and empowered from the very beginning. And given that it is a cemetery, they should be able to make the decision as to its disposition. So that, we talk about, often I advise, with folks like at Montpelier or Colonial Williamsburg now, we'll be moving on to Jamestown. I have contracts with both of these. And Colonial Williamsburg is a good case where the First Baptist Church is being excavated on Colonial Williamsburg that had been removed, dislocated many years before, but the barrels are still there, and they're now doing the archaeology to expose the foundations of the church and the cemetery. The Descendant community is involved right away. I think this is being done the right way. And so my institute is involved with the archaeologists at Colonial Williamsburg to identify human bones. As they excavate, if they run into something that might be human, they share it with us immediately because we have the expertise. And then once they've begun to discover some burial shafts that have human remains. So the next questions will be, do they excavate? Do they have to excavate through the burial shaft? Sometimes there's a ground penetrating radar, which just shows you an anomaly. You might want to excavate just enough to see the top of the grave shaft, the fill that was poured into the hole after the burial was made to affirm that it's a burial. Sometimes they want to go all the way to the burial, but all those decisions about verification, once one has established that it's a cemetery, belong to the descendants. And they may say no to any of it. It's their decision. They can only be empowered if they're there in the beginning.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. We also are of that opinion, and as a member of our coalition, she's part of the scholarship working group. And it's great to have you say that and reaffirm what we've been thinking, which is that it doesn't matter if they say that there are no remains. There are historical records that show that the burial ground was in that particular location. And there hasn't been enough study done at all. There hasn't been any study at all. It's been kept pretty quiet by the city. So thank you for that answer. Appreciate it. The next question would go from, let's see. Anne, did you have another question that you wanted to lift to the front?
Yes, there's a kind of question related to that, and that is that more questions about war remains removed from the Manhattan site, and a larger question of should remains from any historical site be removed, and along with that, isn't part of what descendant communities are fighting for is to leave the remains undisturbed. I realize you just addressed part of that, but maybe to speak about how the decision was made in Manhattan.
Yeah, good. I saw that question, and I thought I had answered it, but clearly was not sufficiently detailed. Our approach to public engagement begins with the assumption that the descendant community determines the disposition of ancestral remains and sacred objects of sites. That's what we did in New York. We came in and said, and that community had already insisted, so it was all very complimentary, that they will be in control. Then, but I got into I didn't say about my history that when I got through being a junior high school nerd, I joined head of Black Student Union in my high school, joined the Black Panther Party, got involved in all kinds of politics, and became an Africanist and so on. So that was our commitment. But when I did as I was learning about archaeology, my interest was in being able to tell stories about people whose history was not written, and the enslaved are among them. So it was important to me as a tool for restoring history that was either not written, or when written about, it was written about by slaveholders who were in New York. They didn't even say what people ate, what they were provisioned to eat. These Africans, they described them as taxable property. So the alternative to that is archaeology is one alternative, but I think it needs to also to be interdisciplinary in its way it interprets the past. So we came to the community from Howard to offer our skills to this client, right? You don't work with a client. I don't work with the NSF when they give me money. I work for what we have agreed. And so we had hearings downtown in Harlem for more than a year, they allowed us to have this conversation about what their questions were about the past. This is the democratization of knowledge that we were formulating in the 1990s. And so our research design that was very, very sophisticated and extensive had more important questions that we saw being answered within the covers of the American Journal of Physical Anthropology or Historical Archaeology. These were important public questions in synthesis with our scholarship. They agreed that we would do that research. And this required us to move the remains to Howard, and the artifacts were being studied at 6 World Trade Center. They were buried in 9/11. There's a longer story to that, as was our Office of Public Education in the World Trade Center. But at any rate, Warren Perry was our Associate Director for Archaeology. We had Edna Medford for History, Alan Goodman and Bone Chemistry and so on, and our geneticists and our art historians. And so we opened our labs to visitation. We had an IFA shrine at the Cobb Laboratory that was kept by practitioners. We had, they didn't interfere with our use of evidential proof. It was with it, not instead. To not integrate in that way. They integrated in people's participation. And so at the end of our research, we returned the remains for reburial. That's what happened in 2003. The Schomburg Center had an extraordinary event. All of this is on films. Rites of ancestral return. They were reburied. I was part of the first major reburial at the Smithsonian in 1986 with Leslie Rankin Hill, who was important in the African burial ground. We had followed Native Americans at the World Archaeological Congress, working on a way of doing archaeology that's ethical. Ultimately, we decided that means doing archaeology with informed consent. Consent means the community has the right to say no. With the right to say no, but in this conversation, leading to questions they were interested in, and an ultimate sacred reburial, they agreed, and the monument was built. As a monument not to the unknown African, I used to like to say, but to people whose history was known, whose ages and what we could find of identity, if you go to the site, are inscribed in the walkway.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We have about 10 more minutes for Q&A. And we had a question from Anne about decolonization, and this is directed to Dr. Uzma Rizvi. And I'll share it for you, Anne, because I know you're probably still trying to collate the questions from the chat. So Dr. Rizvi, could you please share your definition of colonized archaeology and thoughts on how to decolonize it?
Sure. Thank you for that. So I'm a storyteller, so I'm gonna go by way of story, just to make it as explicit and as clear as possible. So as I mentioned before, when I entered into archaeology and the world of archaeology, I didn't know it was a colonial world, right? But it occurred to me that as I was learning it, that it was being taught by, white men who were from the US or England or Germany or one of these other countries that had a lot of money and history of colonial power. And they were going to other parts of the world. They were going to Africa. They were going to South Asia. They were going to the Middle East. And they'd go to these other parts of the world that also happened to be parts of what we know as the colonized world. And they would go and pick up stuff that they thought was important, write about it, leave with the stuff, right? And put it in their museums. And I just remember thinking early on, like, what is this? Like, what are you doing? This is their stuff. What about the people in Syria? What do they think when you just take all this to study, right? And one of the things that I kept getting drilled in me, like kept being told to me, is that this is how it is done. This is how it's always been done because we know better. We are the experts and we tell people their histories. And that just did not sit well with me, right? That's not actually how this has to happen. Once I identified what was colonial, this kind of extractive process, right? I recognized that it wasn't something that was just an international issue, that it was actually happening right here as well. And so linked to this question of colonization is the question of decolonization, right? So in archaeological practice, one of the things I wanted to highlight was that we had to undo what we were all being taught, what all the archaeologists were being taught, and to redo practice in a way that allowed for a more equitable space. And the doing part of this is what is so important, right? Because decolonization is a practice. It's a practical way to attend to the problems that coloniality has placed kind of into the roots of how and what we know. I began to recognize that the way colonial teaching was teaching me how to be an archaeologist went directly against the way I was being taught by my family to know and respect humans as human and equal, right? So when I saw that my roots and teachings were so different from the roots that these universities were teaching me, I knew that this was a systemic problem. The whole thing, from roots to trunk to branches and leaves, it's all tainted with this inequality, with this inequity. And that's what we need to understand about colonialism, that it is something that goes really deep into the ways knowledge is produced, and it moves into the smallest, most banal ways, but it maintains inequality and inequity. And so it's bringing together colonization and coloniality as a system, bring together many different kinds of systems. So one of the systems, for example, is racism. Another one is misogyny. Another is a particular kind of corporate capitalism. And all of this was kind of wrapped up in this sense that these people were doing it to save us, to teach us, to better us, to civilize us, right? And colonialism is such a violent system because it gave specific types of people, and this is what Dr. Blakey's talking, right? There's specific types of people, a particular form of power that's backed up by an entire system. So for example, we could say that enslavement has happened around the world in many different ways. But the way it's happened in this settler colony was particularly brutal and violent and backed up by the system, the laws of this land. You know, I keep thinking back to Ida B. Wells, and she really knew what she was talking about when she did that research on lynching. I think we need to look to our grandmothers and see what they said about how we cannot trust the system until we undo it, until we repair the humanity which settler colonialism has just wiped out. We need to be human again and be recognized as human again. And that's really what is at the core of decolonization. So I found decolonization to bring together, I know you asked about colonization, but I'm like kind of taking it to the core topic here. I found decolonization to kind of bring together my desire to do anti-racist work, to do abolitionist work, to do feminist work, to do work that centers the power back into the community and with people, to educate ourselves about our own histories in our own ways. And, you know, just as a final bit here, when I think about the Flatbush African burial ground, I just want to say, and just to amplify, Shauna, what you were saying, right? If this burial ground is significant to the community, it doesn't matter what the excavations reveals. It is important. Space and place are important. And archaeology recognizes the significance of social and cultural spaces. Also, it's really important to hold the complexity of what's going on at hand. One of the hallmarks of coloniality is the presentation as a logic for something that is better for all of us, right? So, for example, creating youth programs. Like, you know, you look at what they're trying to do there. They're going to create these youth programs. And it's difficult to argue against that, right? It's like what happened at Seneca Village. Having a public park, you know, what we know as Central Park, is generally a good idea, but at what expense, right? In much the same way Seneca Village was erased, that Black history was erased, covering up this burial ground does more harm than good. The significance of a decolonial methodology is that the system cannot tell us what is good for the community. The community tells the system what is good for the community, right? And if the system needs some experts to say that, you know, Dr. Blakey's here, I'm here, I see in the participant list, we've got a lot of archaeologists, we will say it, right? As archaeologists, we can tell you this is important. This work being done by the coalition is important. This space is important. If the system has its own archaeologists to bring to the table to argue otherwise, I bet all of us here would say, bring it, right? Just bring your archaeologists. And so just because I know this is being recorded, I will say, in my expert opinion, as a PhD, an associate professor, as an archaeologist who's been practicing for over 20, 30 years, we must listen to the community and go through an engaged community process that is acknowledged as legitimate by the community, right? In honoring the past and building the future, which is kind of their tagline, what they're essentially doing is silencing the present. And that is just not acceptable, not in the city. That was my long answer. That's how I feel about this.
Thank you so much for that. We really appreciate that. And so we have a question from Trevor. Anne, did you want to share? And then we'll close with our final question from Sharif, who's had her hand up for some time. Yes, thank you.
Yes. So Trevor, feel free to amplify what I'm saying if I don't get this question right. I'm going to try to shorthand it, but it seems like you're recognizing Dr. Blakey's challenge to these notions of neutrality or objectivity. And you asked, don't you think that this false positivist notion of objectivity is a key component of racialization and justifying a class-based society? Isn't this ruling class religious ideal of objectivity the historic doctrine that's granted every owning class since the advent of intensive agriculture the justification to monopolize and exploit the surplus as well as the entire earth? And then as an anthropologist, isn't it our job to root knowledge and truth in history, time, materialism, and ultimately the human experience? Great question.
Well, I do, the longer answer, I would maybe in two places. This article I've been talking about in Current Anthropology, Archaeology Under the Blinding Light of Race does address that in one way. And Frederick Douglass's claims of the Negro ethnologically considered at the beginning of American anthropology, it is anthropology, he's saying he's doing ethnology. It's the first, the nurture argument. It begins the nature-nurture argument as he confronts the craniometricians when their first big volume, Types of Mankind, the year it's published. Every anthropology class should read that. Beyond his introduction of, every introductory course, beyond his introduction of the idea of circumstances, that it's circumstances that create the person, it's not the biology that creates one's circumstances. He challenges the Enlightenment notion of neutrality. So these people who are the racist craniometricians, who are creating, white supremacy and Black inferiority as racial tropes, he says, who made you neutral? No other writers or thinkers can call themselves neutral. Who gave you, and I will paraphrase greatly, the magic method? And I would say further that, if the method, there are two kinds of objectivity. I say, well, objectivity number one is the object. Yes, as scientists, we use evidence, material evidence, objects, and that's a form of objectivity we can verify. It is a way of knowing, and one that's very useful, but not infallible by any means. The other, which is often associated with science, is neutrality. But here's the thing. Can you think of any method that would allow a human being to observe any fact as remaining true throughout all time and space? In other words, can you use objectivity number one, observation, to verify the possibility of a universal neutral truth? It's not a scientific concept. Neutrality is belief, and it's deeply rooted, and I'll finish with this, so as much as one can say. Yes, it is rooted in the attribution of authority, not only to the scientist, but the scientist who's white. It really is associated with, it's the white, the powerful, the male, the scientist who are associated with knowing, simply knowing as individuals in some way, authoritative way, as opposed to being that subjective, political Black, or those political Indians, or the whites, whether they're scientists or whatever they are part of a deep subjectivity, a deep historical subjectivity. And yes, yet they have, throughout their history, since this first 1691 use of the term white to define a people after Christian, arrogated to themselves the idea that they are normal, neutral, universal, Adamic human beings. Everybody else is subjective. This is utter nonsense, but it is the nonsense of power.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much. So 2 more questions, and then we'll go to announcements. One is from Samia Ahmed, who is a Brooklyn College student, and then we'll close our question and answer period with Sharif. Samia, if you're able to speak, could you unmute yourself? And if not, I can read your question for you. Okay, so Samia asks, how does it feel now that it has been 30 years since that National African Burial Ground Monument in Lower Manhattan has been established? Do you think it has served the purpose it was set out to do? That's for Dr. Blakey.
It's a great accomplishment. Nothing is complete.
Great answer. And Sharif, if you could close our question and answer period, go ahead.
Yes, how you doing, everyone? My question will be, I noticed that America and Europeans have always worked in silence. Do the panel know about the markers that is being placed by the United Nations across the east and southern borders of America from slave ships that came directly from Africa to the United States, New York City, Camden, New Jersey, Amboy, places like that where people think that slavery wasn't real in the North. And now we are discovering that these slave ships also landed all the way up north, Boston, New Hampshire. Do the panel know anything about this that's going on right now? That's my question. And thank you.
No, I don't know about it.
Well, Miss Ann Chan and Ann Cobb they are the sponsors of it, and it's called the United Nations Markers Project for the Education and Society Organization, Cultural Society Organization. And you're more than welcome to look it up. Right now, I'm doing a lot of documentation on it, and I would love for the panel and the listeners to really find a way to get involved with this. In fact, we're about to put a marker up in Amboy, New Jersey, on the 29th. So if those of you who can participate would be greatly appreciated.
I'm sorry I didn't recognize that project. I know Ann Chen's group very well. I'm an advisor on it. I think they were inspired by the New York African Burial Ground. She was when she started. Her husband, Charlie Cobb, is famous original SNCC member. They've been doing great work all over the country, putting up historic markers at our sites. So I'm sorry, I didn't recognize that site when you described it.
Would you mind putting that in the chat? Like, can you write it out so folks can see it and understand what you were saying? That's one question. And then I would love to allow for Marcia to share some of the work that she's doing as part of our closing announcements. She's planning a wonderful conference in the end of October that would need some assistance in planning. So Marcia, please take the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. I believe my colleague, Martha Peterson, is also on the, okay, Martha, could you answer?
Okay, yes. Good afternoon, everyone. It's awesome conference. I learned a lot. I would like to say that the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition is organizing a conference to honor our ancestors and to develop a network of non-governmental and independent organizations that will safeguard and protect our African and African American burial grounds. We had planned on having it on October 2nd, but because of all the activities we're involved in, on Monday, we have a rally to protest the sale of the Moses Cemetery. On Wednesdays, we're at the Moses Cemetery. We have a rally. On Fridays, we have our weekly meetings. Now we're involved with our court case with Montgomery County. And we have also partnered with Dr. Barber and the Poor People's Campaign. Because of that, we've had to put the conference off to the end of October. And we hope that everyone will be able to participate in this conference because it's going to give us a chance to share information and develop platforms that will help us all to communicate with each other and just present information that we all need to know on what we need to do to stop the desecration of African burial grounds. So we're planning on having this at the end of October. And also, I would like to announce a call to action to ask that everyone be aware that our court case against Montgomery County will take place this Monday, September 27th at 9:30 a.m. And Macedonia Baptist Church, Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, as well as some of the descendants of Moses Cemetery will be in court presenting our case to stop the sale of Moses Cemetery. And I'd like to ask if you want to fast that day, that would be wonderful. Fasting is very helpful with prayer. But if not fasting, please send some prayers out to help us with our court case so that we can win. We'll be in court at 9:30 Monday morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So if folks are willing to fast and pray in solidarity with the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, let's do that. Their court case is on Monday. Thank you so much for joining us. And so we're at the close of our time together. And I want to thank our sponsors and our co-sponsors for helping us put together this wonderful event. But before I do that, I want to thank Dr. Blakey and Dr. Coleman Adebayo, Dr. Rizvi, and Dr. Ngadi for taking time out of your busy schedules to share with us your insight and your information. And I hope that this is the beginning of a very long and fruitful process of creating a roadmap for future discoveries of African burial grounds together, both nationally and internationally. If you want to get involved with our coalition, the first thing that we would ask for you to do is to sign our petition so that the city will stop the RFP process for our burial ground. And then you can join us. We'll have a new member orientation soon where you'll learn more about the coalition and how we work. And finally, once again, thanking the sponsors, in particular, the Wolf Institute at Brooklyn College, Brooklyn Level Up, Flatbush Mixtape, Grow House NYC, as well as all the others that I can't name. We will be also sharing this presentation, the recording of this presentation, to everyone who registered through Eventbrite. And so thank you all for joining, and I invite you to just spend a moment of silence, and you can check out whenever you're ready. Thank you so much.
Tammy.
All right. Thank you all so much. And I am going to stop recording now and save the chat. And for the facility.
Recording stopped.